Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our Bazy Tankersley Southwest Laureate lecture. Some of you might recall that part 1 was in April, and we're truly grateful for your participation this afternoon. My name is Jeff Bannister, and I'm the director of the University of Arizona Southwest Center, a unit in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. As we get started, I want to remind everyone that the University of Arizona's Tucson campus occupies the lands of the Tohono O'odham, Pascua Yaqui, and Apache peoples, and that the state of Arizona is the homeland of more than 20 other tribal nations. We respect their cultures and histories, as well as those of indigenous peoples everywhere. I also want to give a shout out to our other University of Arizona co-sponsors for this event. The School of Anthropology, the Center for Latin American Studies, the Department of Mexican American Studies, and SBS Mexico initiatives. Thank you very much for your support. We appreciate you. So the Southwest Laureate Lecture honors the late Ruth McCormick, or Bazy Tankersley, one-time newspaper publisher, philanthropist, and a supporter of numerous important causes in the Southwest and the borderlands, from conservation and environmental research to youth education. And for many years, Bazy was the host of what she called the annual Straw Bale Forum, which was held at her ranch in Williams, Arizona, which was the Hat Ranch. And the forums were intended to bring together community leaders, researchers, and activists to talk about strategies for addressing the region's pressing issues. And so our Southwest Laureate Lecture Series recognizes Bazy's lasting contribution and draws inspiration from those straw bale forums. Pardon me. So before I introduce our speaker, just a couple of words about housekeeping. The talk is being recorded, and then we'll upload and make it available on our YouTube channel probably within a week or so. And this is going to be done by the Southwest Center's outreach coordinator, Carlos Quintero, who is behind the scenes here today with me, working the back channels and keeping things moving. So thank you, Carlos. And the talk will last about 45 minutes to an hour. And then we're going to have lots of time, hopefully, for question and answer on the other end. So we'll allow everyone to just unmute yourselves if you want to say something. Probably would be best to just raise your hand and I can call on you as questions arise. And then also I will keep an eye on the chat box as well to field questions for Carlos. Okay. So it's pardon me. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Carlos Velez Ibanez, who is backed by popular demand, and to bring home the presentation that he began in April. Don Carlos is a Regents Professor and Founding Director Emeritus of the School of Transborder Studies at Arizona State University, and also founder of the University of Arizona's own Bureau of Applied Research and Anthropology, or known to many of us as BARA. He was born in Nogales, Arizona, raised in Tucson, and he earned his doctorate in anthropology from UCSD in 1975. He has authored at least 12 books, probably some out there that I didn't uncover in my Google search, some of which have been published in Spanish, and his CV includes numerous articles and book chapters. Among Carlos's books are 3 from the University of Arizona Press: Hegemonies of Language and Their Discontents, published in 2017, a volume co-edited with Josiah Heyman, The U.S.-Mexico Transborder Region, Cultural Dynamics and Historical Interactions, also published in 2017. That was a busy year. And a beautiful academic biography called Reflections of a Transborder Anthropologist, From Netzahualcoyotl to Aztlan, published in 2020. And this last book earned him the American Association of Hispanic Higher Education's Distinguished Author Award in 2021. In 2016, he was inducted as a member of the Mexican Academy of Sciences, becoming the first foreign anthropologist to be selected for the award and joining 107 other members, including 10 Nobel Prize winners. And then in 2021, he earned the American Anthropological Association's Solon T. Kimball Award for Public and Applied Anthropology, honoring significant contributions to the development of applied anthropology and for the impacts of his work on public policy. And I think that's really important to emphasize, that Don Carlos's work has a lot of impact, and it is both at the level of theoretical anthropology and applied anthropology, and there really aren't that many people who can claim that dual mantle. Dr. Vélez Ibáñez will be speaking to us today about the Southwest North American region of political ecology of cultures and hegemonies. So, Don Carlos, take it away.
Thank you very much. For those of you that are here for the second time for more punishment, I greet you especially with a fond hello. And I thank you very much for this opportunity to, in a more detailed manner, relate to you some basic notions of what I've termed the Southwest North American region. And of course, I'm not going to go over everything that we did the last time. I started with the pre-Hispanic period and really tried to insert both historical and cultural knowledge for a couple of thousand years. So I thought I'd come back for a second try to give you a more intense understanding of this region, because I think for too long we always concentrate only on the border as if it were a permanent fixture of the physical ecology of the region. And of course, as I pointed out many times, the border is only 2 grandmothers old, and an artifact, of course, of historical circumstances and war. But among the great impacts of that war and the transference of eventually altogether about half of Mexico to the United States, including, of course, the Texas Revolt of 1835 and the much later Gadsden Purchase of 1853, and as the aftermath of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The establishment of a transborder and labor economy is something that is not very well stressed in much of the current literature. To understand how it is that, in fact, the dynamics, the economic and political dynamics, in fact, are not just of the border, but rather of the region itself. And it really did begin in the 19th century with the establishment of a transborder economic system, as well as a labor system simultaneously. And it was really introduced at the industrial level of the way in which you organize production, certainly in the state of Arizona and in the Mexican state of Sonora. And from my particular point of view, Sonora and Arizona constitute, from my particular point of view, really one of the major functioning, although unequal, transborder economies. And it begins, of course, with the establishment, especially of the mines and of large-scale ranching and large-scale agriculture on both sides of the border, especially during the political regime of Porfirio Diaz, beginning in about 1875 through 1910. And what marks, of course, the establishment of the industrial mode of production in agriculture and in ranching and in mining, and of course the creation of large-scale urbanization on both sides of the border and throughout the region, is in fact the reliance on 3 major characteristics of any kind of economic system, and that is land, capital, and labor. And therefore the introduction of this form of organization induced then a number of economic and cultural patterns that exist even to this day in different forms. One of the most important established kind of meta-theoretical kind of dynamics is the establishment of a fluctuating transborder business cycle. So that, in fact, you can't look at the Mexican economy along, especially the Mexican states and the Mexican transborder region, without looking, of course, at the American mirror to that. Because what happens in the United States happens in Mexico. And there's an old saying that, in fact, when the United States burps, Mexico, in fact, has a stomachache. So you have to understand that we are dealing with an asymmetrical transborder economy here, as well as, however, very importantly, a transborder labor system as well. And that's been in operation since the 19th century. So labor, immigration, and wage structures are all tied very much to a transborder economy. And with it as well, what I would call the transborder enforcement of worker discipline, especially in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And the poster child for those four major kind of theoretical outcomes. In fact, you can post them very easily into the whole Clifton-Morenci, Metcalfe-Cananea sub-region of what I would call the sub-region of inequality. Because what also happens when this industrial system is established, also is created a dual wage structure, and which is based on basically ethnicity. So you have Mexican miners, for example, in American mines, who had been, by the way, those very mines, of course, had been Mexican just a few years before the Gadsden Purchase, and a few years before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, at least remnants of that. You have Mexican miners being paid less for the same work as American miners. So you had a laborer's rate, and then you had a Mexican rate, and that dual wage structure existed perennially almost through 1960, from the 19th century. As well as, however, what is also established is a series of segregations, but segregated towns. Tifton and Morenci are themselves segregated according to ethnicity many times, where Mexicans living on one side, Americans living on another, and even Lithuanians, in fact, having their own camp areas as well. And of course, you have the schooling as well, being segregated, especially at the elementary school level. But that also occurs all the way through the state of Arizona as well. But also that establishes some very interesting household dynamics, in which, in fact, you have Mexican households very much seeming to be isolated, but at the same time affords opportunities for Mexicans to create their own business, and that is serving Mexican households with Mexican businesses. And that creates, in a very ironic and contradictory way as well, a kind of the beginnings of a Mexican middle class. But with all of that, nevertheless, you do have the introduction of what I would suggest are racist ideologies of difference. And it's a very different kind of racism than that established, for example, during the Spanish and Mexican periods towards indigenous populations. Here you have the American version is very much tied to the notion of mongrelization. That Mexicans somehow are Mexicans because they're of mixed racial heritage. And that is permeated in much of the ideology that, in fact, is proffered, especially during the 20s and the 30s, during the height of the eugenics movement in the United States. But with all of these conditions, of course, you also have, of course, Mexican miners and miners in general, not necessarily just lying down and being the objects of exploitation, because in fact, they participated in forming unions and in strikes. But as well as, however, what also occurs is strike breaking. Because what happens is that because you have this fluctuating transborder business cycle established, you also have what people relied on, what's known in economics as the elasticity of labor, which is another fancy word of basically saying, well, let's use labor when we need it and then kick it out when we don't. So you have, and if you have strikes, then what you do is you fire those workers and you import more labor, which is just across the border or just across the street in this case. So you have this constant dynamic of strike breaking, using, in fact, Mexican labor many times as both the objects of the strikes and their firing and their replacement by, in fact, Mexican labor brought in, especially to replace them. And that creates a very series of internal conflicts, even within the communities themselves. But at the same time, you have the establishment of transborder unions. All of these, of course, the transborder unions themselves, especially led by the PLM and also the IWW, these were, in fact, unions that eventually came to fruition in the late 19th century and certainly in the early 20th century. Many of which, of course, were broken up. Their strikes were broken up by transborder policing. On the one hand, in Cananea, many of the strikes were broken up by the Mexican Rurales. On the American side, you have strikes being broken up by the Arizona Rangers and the sheriffs as well. So you have this kind of transborder enforcement, in fact, occurring simultaneously. All of that eventually leads, of course, to the Mexican Revolution, which we'll talk about in a minute. To give you an indication, then, of course, that what you are dealing with, especially if you're looking at Arizona and Sonora and certainly parts of Chihuahua and Baja California, you're dealing basically with, in fact, a copper vein, which is a huge rendering both in the Sierra Madres and the lower part of the Rocky Mountains. You have a copper veins, in fact, all the way from Resolution, Arizona, all the way down almost to Culiacan, Sinaloa themselves. So you have to understand that what we have here, in fact, are shared copper mineralization, both on the Arizona and the Sonora side, which are then taken advantage by what? By, in fact, transborder companies. So what you have is the creation of a transborder economy, especially between 1878 and 1910. So, for example, copper mines in both Arizona and Sonora were owned and operated by Americans like Colonel William C. Greene, who owned the Cananea Consolidated Copper Company in the late 19th and early 20th century. You have the Greene Consolidated Copper Company, which owned over 10,000 acres in the Cananea Mountains of the then free zone of the northern Sonora, about 20 miles south of the Arizona border. And they held another 486,000 acres of timber and grazing land leased by Greene's Cananea Cattle Company. So you have cattle companies, you have mining, all of this in the control of what I would call transborder companies. And of course, you have then labor movements going in both directions. So whenever you have strikes, of course, you have extra legal methods to suppress them. But nevertheless, accompanying mining and also transborder unions is also the spread of American industrial agriculture, especially in the remnants of the Mexican Republic by such companies as Anderson and Clayton and Sonora, and especially Ciudad Obregón, which is in many ways a created American town in Sonora, and the International Company of Mexico of Chihuahua was made possible, especially in Sonora, by the Mexican Railroad, built by whom? The Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe Railroad, to link Guaymas to the Arizona border in the north with mostly what? Chinese labor. Thus, in Sonora alone, by 1902, $37,500,000 was invested in mining and agriculture, and with its social transformation mirroring those in Arizona during the same period because of intense capital formation. In addition to which, if you look at the agricultural arena, in the Valley of Mexicali, the Colorado River Land Company was founded in 1901 by Harrison Gray Otis, the publisher of the LA Times. His son-in-law, Harry Chandler, also later publisher of the Times, and William Randolph Hearst and his chain of 28 newspapers. By 1904, their Mexican intermediaries, they were able to amass 400,000 hectares of the Valley of Mexicali to take advantage of the Alamo Canal, and this is the ironic part, which itself has been developed by the California Development Company to divert Colorado River water to the Imperial Valley by constructing the canal near Yuma, but crossing into Mexico through the Rancho de Algodones and running 80 kilometers to the west through Mexican territory to finally end up into the United States, where Calexico is now. So what you have here then is a transborder canal originating in the United States, going into Mexico, and then making its roundabout route back into, in fact, for the benefit of the Imperial Valley. The Colorado Land Company by 1912 had been named the largest cotton ranch in the world, having taken advantage of the Transborder Canal with its diverted Colorado rivers. Now, so at the advent of the Mexican Revolution, American individuals and companies owned 78% of the mine production and its lands, 58% of the oil production, the rest divided mostly among British and other foreign investors, and ownership of the land and subsoil, 68% of plastic factories, 67% of railroad companies, and 72% of all other companies, including retail stores, hotels, theaters, and soap and textile. Now, none of this, of course, could have occurred without the direct mediation by the Mexican government itself under the control of Porfirio Diaz, the dictator of Mexico, which then created a very unsatisfied Mexican working class on both sides of the border. Again, I have to emphasize that these are transborder economies, and with it, of course, you have also transborder cultural impacts that benefited both parts of the population to different degrees. Now, I wanted to point out this particular PowerPoint for you. This is a picture of my aunt, Teresita, this tall one here. And by the way, my aunt Teresa Vélez was 6 foot. And the Vélezes in general are pretty tall folks. My dad was 6 foot. My tío Lauro, I think, was 6'5". My tío Manuel was 6'3". My tío Ricardo was about 6'4", around in there. These are all big dudes. This picture is taken of these tri-generational women in Tubutama, Sonora. And what's interesting, of course, is what you have is this box with these flowers, and it's the Royal Baking Soda flower planter, taken in probably about 1901, 1902. But my point is that you have Mexican tortillas being made with Royal Baking Soda, and its box used then as a planter. And you have this kind of cultural, if you want, cultural impact throughout Sonora as well. And as you can see, the dresses themselves are of a late 19th century, early 20th century flavor. The hub on the right-hand side is in fact a wheel hub for a Conestoga wagon, and that the hub as well as the wagon was made by my grandfather. And this label right here tacked on, which is Manuel A. Vélez. Now, this picture has two very significant aspects to it. First of all, the wagon hub itself was made, as I said, by my grandfather in a factory that he had in Magdalena, Sonora, in which he employed 50 men making wagon trains, Conestoga wagons, as well as stagecoaches and surreys. And what's interesting, of course, is that he had his nameplate on here, but if you notice, it's Manuel A. Vélez. Now, the usual way in which Mexicans, in fact, say their name, or rather write their name, is the way I do, Carlos Vélez Ibáñez. Vélez is my surname, my paternal name, and Ibáñez is my maternal surname. But here you have Manuel A. Vélez, which is the American version of the way in which you write your name. That is, your first name, your middle initial is your last. So already you have a cultural impact of American, even the American writing styles, to my grandfather in Magdalena, Sonora, which is 60 miles south of Tucson. The other interesting part of this wagon hub is that the iron holdings here, fasteners, as well as the fastener at the very top, were all made of Norwegian steel, or Norwegian iron, which was imported into Sonora through Veracruz. The other part of this is, which is very interesting, is that my grandfather used to sell then these Conestoga wagons especially for the mines in Arizona, as well as stagecoaches and surreys. And I'll show you a picture of a surrey to Federico Ronstadt in Tucson. And Federico Ronstadt then would take the nameplate off and put his own on and sell it to the American public. And I think this is probably done in about 1903. One of the first examples of what I would suggest to you is a maquiladora, this time directed by my grandfather. And this is one of my grandfather's Surreys, which is in fact in the Arizona State Museum there in Tucson. And what's interesting is the nameplate here says that this was made by an unknown blacksmith in Sonora. Well, the fact of the matter is, this wagon was made by my grandfather in Magdalena in his shop. Now, these enormous changes, though, however, led to a great deal of turmoil in Mexico, inequality as well. And it also led to, of course, the loss of land grants by many Mexicans on the northern side of the Southwest North American region, social stratification. You also had literacy laws and political disenfranchisement in the north, and really exacerbated capitalism in the south, very uncontrolled one. You also have, of course, on both sides of the border, you have both cultural, linguistic, and relationships in which Americans is really up to about 1880 learned Spanish, and it became very Mexicanized, especially in Tucson. Because what's very interesting, one of the most fascinating aspects is that intermarriage between Mexicans and Anglos was at about a 25 to 30% rate up to about 1888, until, in fact, the introduction of the railroad, which then allowed American women to come in from the East Coast. Of course, what occurs is you have many European immigrants coming into the state of Arizona who themselves did not speak English. But Mexicans, of course, were made foreigners in Tucson, as well, made foreigners throughout the Southwest North American region on the American side. As well as, of course, you had both cooperation and conflict. Why? Well, because racialism, unfortunately, was still alive, and this was especially common in the schools. But the Mexican Revolution side of the ledger here, however, is very important, because, in fact, that leads to 1 million Mexicans dying during the revolution. And that revolution was very much in fact, a transborder revolution. Why? Well, because, in fact, most of the arms came from the United States, as well as at one time Madero, in fact, was in El Paso in exile. And many of the revolutionaries, of course, were sometimes in exile in Tucson as well. So you have the transborder region itself is the site for a transborder revolution. Nevertheless, you have almost a million Mexicans, at least that's the best guesstimate, in fact, coming across the border during and after the revolution, but especially during. And also another 1 million killed during the revolution itself. And you had professionals, landowners, middle-class workers, landless peasants, all of them who, in fact, came across during the Mexican Revolution. And I wanted to show you, this is a picture of my grandfather, Julio Ibanez Camarillo, who, in fact, was killed at the Battle of Las Vacas in Coahuila. He was a colonel in the Mexican army itself, and was killed with a bullet to the stomach as he was boarding the train. I was going to read a bit of a short story for you to give you an indication of the blood and guts of the revolution, but I'm not going to have time to do that. Rather, I'm going to switch a little bit to you for you and give you an indication that the Mexican Revolution was, in fact, truly, because of the almost 1 million Mexicans that came across, also a font for also the movement of ideologies across the border. And so what occurred, the revolution itself carried with them a certain kind of ideological presumptions and ideological convictions. Among them, what I would call the Indianist philosophy, and that is a kind of yearning for the past, and with a great deal of appreciation of, as well as admiration for, indigenous populations. This kind of quest of indigenism is really reflected in the Mexican icon of the Guadalupe, of the Virgen de Guadalupe, that is the Virgin of Guadalupe, who is herself an indigenous version of the Spanish Virgin herself. And so you see that in all sorts of venues, certainly in Sonora, certainly in Arizona, throughout the Southwest. Another ideological kind of conviction that was also carried forth by former revolutionaries and by many persons from Mexico was the whole notion of historical confrontation. And that is one of the main ideological streams within the Mexican Revolution was anarchism, not just Marxism, but anarchism. And that is basically the notion that the government should stay away, and in fact, it should only be organized groups, political groups, who in fact should be in charge of both their present and the future. As well as the notion of cultural nationalism. Cultural nationalism is based on the notion of mestizaje. That is that Mexicans basically proclaim their genetic and cultural origins, and they exhibit, for example, the multiplicity of their origins rather than seeking purity, which is just the opposite, of course, of the American notion of Mexicans of that period, in which they regarded, in fact, Mexicans as mongrels. So you have this kind of oppositional ideological confrontation between people lauding their, in fact, mixed heritage, and those who, in fact, look at mixed heritage as a weakness and a kind of mongrel existence. One of the most important ideological transferences also as well was what I would suggest to you is Mexican revolutionary feminism. And this is expressed by especially the women who belong to the Partido Liberal Mexicano, which was strongly feminist and culturally nationalistic and very democratic and very protective of indigenous populations. And that, of course, that influenced many young women in the United States, by the way, to take on very strong political positions as well. And you'll see some of that in a minute. Last but not least, of course, is that you also have, following the revolution, an internal Mexican revolution by the Cristeros. And that is Catholics who very much resented the imposition of a state imposed anti-Catholic series of regulations, including not allowing priests to wear Roman collars, the closing of Catholic schools. And the closing of Catholic schools, however, have a very important unintended consequence, because you have about 5,000 priests and nuns who formerly taught in parochial schools in Mexico, especially in Sonora, Coahuila, and Chihuahua, coming across the border and establishing then Catholic schools in the United States that, in fact, were also the avenues for the creation of the Mexican middle class in the United States, in Texas, and certainly in Arizona. So in a way, all of those nuns who, in fact, who came across the border, especially during the Cristero revolt, as well as some of the priests, became, in fact, the organizers of Catholic schools in the Southwest. Those are, I think, a very important kind of ideological transferences, and you see that's indicated in the real life of individuals. And I'm going to give you just two examples. My grandfather, while my grandfather was being killed in Coahuila, my grandmother in Santiago, Nayarit, was in fact treating revolutionary wounded. So that in the oral histories of my own family and the oral histories of many of our families, which had never been told before, and by the way, many of us who in fact were afforded the opportunity to write about them much later on, we have then, as part of the oral tradition, an understanding of contradictions. That is that life itself very much is filled with contradiction, and that life is not linear. So that kind of attitude, if you want, of two simultaneous oppositional, if you want, events or activities or points of view may exist in the same time and place. And that's been very much part of the inheritance of this population. So when I grew up as a kid, my mother would tell stories about her mother, in fact, treating wounded in the courtyard of her home by using her own bed sheets as well as pillows to stop the gaping wounds of wounded revolutionaries. At the same time, however, that my grandfather was being killed by revolutionaries in Coahuila. Secondly, another part of the oral histories of my family was on my dad's side. And that is during the revolution in Magdalena, a colonel came through with his troops, and for one reason or another didn't particularly take a liking to the Mexican mayor. And the Mexican mayor was a compadre of my dad's oldest brother, of my tío Lauro. And a compadre, of course, is a co-godparent. And it's a very important and in many ways a very sacred relationship between people. But the colonel killed my uncle's co-godparent, his compadre, shot him. And of course, then my uncle then had to take care of the man's wife. And eventually my uncle became, in fact, the mayor of the town. Now, as time progressed, however, the Vélez family itself was in fact targeted to be murdered by this colonel and others. And they in fact left in 1912 and got into a Hupmobile. This is a Hupmobile of 1912, and in fact drove from Magdalena, Sonora to Tucson. And before they got to Nogales, the axle broke, and my tío Laura, in fact, forged an axle at a blacksmith shop, and in fact was able to solder it, or at least was able to integrate it within the axle of the Hupmobile itself. And they made it just across the border as the revolutionaries on horseback got to the line itself and stopped at the line while my dad and his brothers and my grandfather got across the border to escape the revolutionaries. But there's one more level of this story, and that is that after the revolutionary colonel himself fell out of favor, and in fact then escaped the justice of his having killed not only my uncle's co-godparent, but also many others. But as time went on, he escaped, and my uncle got wind that in fact that former revolutionary colonel was escaping through Nogales. So that my uncle in fact waited at the border to see if he could catch up with the guy. And he noticed that there was an ice wagon that in fact was crossing the border from the Mexican side, from Nogales, Sonora to Nogales, Arizona, because at that time the ice plant was in Nogales, Sonora, and it was sold in Nogales. The ice itself was sold in Nogales, Arizona. But he noticed that this ice truck, however, was not dripping water. So he stopped the truck at the line. And by the way, the border at that time in probably in about 1914, 1915, was only a yellow line in between Nogales, Sonora and Nogales, Arizona. And so he stopped the ice truck, and sure enough, the former colonel was hiding under some gunny sacks, as the story says. And my uncle pulled him out, took out his 45 Colt, and shot him at the border. And the tale goes that the guy's body fell across the yellow line with his blood flowing towards the north and his feet in the south. And so what you have to understand that for us, for many of us who are born in this region, we very much are part of it, not only in terms of the economic and kind of and political explanations that we offer, but we've lived this. We've lived this in to many different degrees. And so here you have, years later, my dad here in Tucson, and this is the front of the store of La Bonanza, and you see Alex Jacome here, my dad here, and the rest of the clerks. But what's interesting about this picture is that you have both Anglos and Mexicans working together in a store, in fact, owned by a Mexican storeman himself. And this is about 1916. What occurs, of course, is again, you have this elasticity of labor idea coming into play, and you have very shortly after during the Depression, by 1929, 1930, the so-called repatriation of Mexicans from the Southwest. And here you have a picture, in fact, of Mexicans fixing their rear tire, again, being expelled from the United States. You have about, the best guess is about 300 to 400,000 Mexicans are expelled, of which about a little more than a quarter are American citizens born in the United States. And here's another representation of that of Los Angeles, people saying goodbye. Many of them, of course, were forced on trains as well. Others voluntarily went. At the same time, during this same period of the 20s and 30s, you also have the rise of the eugenics movement, based on this whole notion of mongrelization. Between 1910 and especially about 1940, especially, you have these kind of eugenics movements in which Mexicans themselves are looked upon as inferior. And let me give you just an indication of this in this paragraph, in fact, which begins with buttressed by a series of organizations especially focused on racial mixing as the basis for deportation and expulsions. These included the following: the Immigration Study Commission of California, the Immigration Restriction League, the Order of White Citizens of America, the National Society of Daughters of the American Revolution, and the National Society of Sons of the American Revolution. However, not only were obvious racist organizations involved, but also organizations supported by well-known academicians. One of these was the Allied Patriotic Societies, Inc., whose vice president appeared before the Immigration Naturalization Committee with a memorial signed by 44 well-known professors and scientists who expressed their fear that there could be no racial status quo and therefore no reasonable degree of racial homogeneity. Basic racial homogeneity was necessary, they felt, for civilization to have its best development. The list of those who signed the memorial included professors from Princeton, Harvard, University of Wisconsin, Yale, New York University, University of Michigan, and Columbia. C.C. Little, president of the University of Michigan, A. Lawrence Lowell, president of Harvard, Madison Grant, president of the New York Zoological Society, Robert C. Ward, professor of climatology of Harvard. In addition, Lopez, who's one of the originators of this paragraph, that the American Federation of Labor's position of immigration had long been restrictionist, and in 1924 it had adopted the eugenics argument. So you have then this awful kind of eugenics movement going on at the same time that you have the reparation and the expulsion of Mexicans from the United States. And this gives you an indication here, is if you look at Tempe Normal School, which is now ASU, between 1899 and 1939, these are, in fact, this is the breakdown of registered enrollment in Tempe Normal School during this entire period of 40-some years. 151 Mexican Americans, 8 African Americans, 6 Asian Americans. And the segregated schools are very common, especially in Maricopa County. And teachers, for example, were given 2 years certificates for Mexican American students for Mexican schools, while in fact the rest of the schools were in fact teachers were all graduated from the university itself. But somehow Mexican kids had to suffer through segregated schools with teachers who had 2 years of preparation. Much of this, of course, was overthrown by the Romo versus Lard decision in 1925. One of the first, in fact, anti-segregation legislative act, not legislative, but judicial acts that in fact prohibited segregation of Mexican children as well. Enough of that. On into World War II, because World War II, in fact, for the Mexican population itself is a hallmark event for many reasons. This is a period in which, in fact, Mexico, more than 500,000 Mexicans participate in World War II, with the highest, in fact, number of Medal of Honors awarded to this population group during World War II. But it's also filled with conflict because you have also what is known as the Pachuco movement, where you have young men dressed in this particular way, young women dressed in this particular way, and all considered, of course, gang members, many of whom were not. This was the style of the period. but nevertheless, many of them were rounded up, especially in Los Angeles, and beaten up by sailors and Marines during World War II, or in fact thrown in jail for wearing pompadours of this type, or wearing what's called the zoot. And of course, they were also stereotyped. And here you have a depiction of what they call zoot high schoolers. And this is the first time I've ever seen zoot high schoolers with Letterman's jackets on. So you have, these are just high school kids wearing this particular mode of dress and being typecast as zooters, when in fact the origin of the zoot is in New York. But also look at the pompadours themselves, where in fact this particular style of hairdo for women in fact comes right out of Hollywood. And this particular individual in the middle right here is no less than James Stewart, the actor. And here you have a couple dancing boogie woogie who are not Mexican, but not considered zooters. So you have this kind of stereotypic kind of imposition on this population. At the same time, by the way, you have the highest number of awards being awarded of any cultural group to Hispanos. And here you have just one list during World War II: Lucia Adams, Rudolph Davila, Macario Garcia, Harold Gonzalez, David Gonzalez, Silvestre Herrera, Jose Lopez, Jose P. Martinez, Manuel Perez, Cleto Rodriguez, Alejandro Ruiz, Jose Valdez, Ismael Villegas. Most of these, by the way, were awarded posthumously. And that's the other aspect, of course, is that you have, here you have Jose Lopez being awarded the Medal of Honor. And he's a diminutive little guy, but he is in fact one of the bravest soldiers of World War II, having captured something like also 300 enemy soldiers. But one of the constants of, in fact, Hispanos and especially Mexicanos is that Mexicans have participated in American wars since in fact the Civil War. Because in fact there were 13,000 Mexicans that fought for the Confederacy, and about the same number fought for the Union during the Confederacy. And they fought, in fact, also in the Spanish-American War. They fought in World War II, and certainly in World War I, and certainly in World War II. And one of the constants is that, in fact, is an overrepresentation of Mexicans, especially among those killed. If you look at the total Mexican origin populations of 1940, about 1.5 million, or about 1.63% of Hispanics of the total population, of which 77% of that 1.63% were of Mexican origin. In Arizona in 1940, of the total population of 500,000, of which 15% were Hispanic. And the average and the age draft cohort of 18 to 25 were about 7.5% males and females, with about 3% Mexican origin males eligible for combat in the 3 counties. And these are the percentages of killed in action. 3%, 21% killed. Of those killed in Maricopa County were in fact of Mexican origin. In Pima County, 32%. In Santa Cruz County, 56%. Or in those 3 counties, 36% of all KIAs in World War II were of Mexican origin, and making up about 3% of the population. And this is the reality. And I can tell you personally, having being a little kid, and after Sunday, and on Sunday, what we would do is we go to different cousins' homes as well as uncles, and we'd go visit friends. And after Mass, we went to visit the Acostas. But when we visited the Acostas on Sunday, a telegram arrived that Bobby had died in a prisoner of war hospital after being shot down over Germany. Mrs. Acosta's screams would indelibly be etched in my mind and soul, and they remain there to even this moment. So World War II touched many Mexican families, both wounded and deceased. At the same time, Felix Longoria, killed in the Philippines, was refused burial in Three River, Texas. And here's the Arizona Bushmasters themselves, who were composed of both Native Americans and Mexican Americans, and many working class Anglos as well. And one of the most interesting aspects, especially for Mexican women of World War II, was in fact Mexican women working outside of the household. And this is really this generation was an important generation, because in fact they left many of the patriarchal kind of cultural patterns, and in fact freed themselves from the clutches of male control. And what's really interesting, especially for the Tucson case, is that in fact the first case of sexual harassment was in fact won by Mexican women in 1943, after they had in fact replaced men on the railroad themselves. Again, this is just an example in Maricopa County of the 2% of the total eligible population just in Maricopa County, and this is just from the alphabet from A to H. About 20% of this listing here were in fact of Mexican origin. Again, an overrepresentation of Mexicans themselves. World War II ends, and of course you have vets coming back, and they no longer are going to accept the conditions of the pre-war. I can tell you that, for example, in Maricopa County, there were certain streets that Mexicans could not cross, and they were arrested by the police. You had, in fact, a very acute police Mexican relationships in the Southwest, in many areas of the Southwest, certainly in Arizona, but especially in Maricopa County. But when the vets came back, they said, we're not going to take this anymore, and they formed, especially their own veterans organizations, because in fact they couldn't. Mexicans could not join the American Legion after World War II. And so they developed their own American Legion posts, among them, of course, the American Legion Post 41 here in Phoenix, which was, in fact, assisted in its organization by Barry Goldwater. And this takes us into the post-war period, where you have, in fact, Mexicans going to school, Mexicans taking advantage of the GI Bill as well. But you still have widespread labor characteristics into the 1960s that, in fact, very much speak to the continuing inequality in labor and employment, in politics, all across the board, in education, with some of the lowest educational attainments of any parts of the population. You have civil rights violations of many sorts throughout the Southwest, and that leads then to us to consider that during the 1960s, you have, for example, the medians. If you look at the median years of schooling in Arizona, the median was 12.1 for Spanish surname. It was 7.0 for non-white, was 7.0 in California. Similarly, all the way across the board into Texas, 11.5. And look at Texas, Spanish surname, 4.8 was the median years of education. This is in 1960. And which is absolutely ridiculous. This is the estimated number of poor and percent of poor persons and families in 1960. If you look at the Spanish surname, percent of poor in each group, 32.8%, 17.8% for the total population, 38% among non-whites. So you have each group of percent of all poor, about 22% then especially of Mexicans. These are Spanish surname, but they're 99% Mexican in poverty, living in poverty. So yet again, however, prior to 1960, you still had Mexicans, in fact, serving in war again. And you have many serving, of course, in Korea. And this is the Easy Company, a 13th Infantry Battalion from Tucson itself, from which, in fact, 12 never returned. These are the guys, all from Tucson: Nacho Cruz and Oscar Nunez, Darwin Aycock, Jimmy Ward, Ralph Castello, Albino Malhaca, Albert Felix, Jimmy Fisher, Bobby Fisher, and so on and so on. All of these guys in Korea. And here's a picture of Gene Suarez and Tommy Price and Jimmy Ward, Valdemar Leon, Albert Felix, and Gene Suarez, of course, is my brother-in-law. And he came back from Korea. He was pretty well suffering from post-traumatic stress. And when he visited our house, I remember he was courting my sister Lucy. And my mom gave him a cup of coffee. And I noticed that he couldn't hold a cup of coffee in his hand because his hand shook so much. And I asked him why his hand shook so much. I was just a dumb little kid. And he says that he had been sick. But the fact of the matter is he was blown up twice in Korea. He was the only Chicano combat photographer in Korea. And all of these guys are former Marines. Medal of Honor awardees, again, same thing. You have 3 Marines from Puerto Rico. All the rest of them are from LA, San Bernardino, Colton, El Paso, Los Angeles. Most of them, however, if you'll notice the KIA next to their names, they're all posthumous. And you see the same thing occurring during the Vietnam, where you have, in fact, again, an overrepresentation of Mexicans as well as other Hispanos, especially Puerto Ricans. Of the 58,000 casualties in Vietnam between 1961 and 1973, I estimate at least 20% of all those killed came from the Southwest, where Mexicans would never have the opportunity to travel anywhere else. For Arizona alone, 80 Mexican youths were killed in a 2-year period, December 1967 to 1969, which represents over 24% of all casualties in the state. And this was at a time in which you had about 5% of the population. For this same period, almost 40% of all casualties from New Mexico were Mexicans. From Texas, all casualties, 25% were Mexican. From Colorado and Arizona, 19.1% and 14% from California. The total percentage of young Mexicans never returning was almost 20%. Given the intensification of the war up to June 1969, the total estimated percentage is 20% of all killed is conservative. So again, you have this overrepresentation of Mexicans in Vietnam. And of course, the 1960s are, in fact, a hallmark of the Chicano movement, because the Chicano movement arises from the great dissatisfaction of the statistics that I just provided you previously, both in income, in labor, in education, and in overrepresentation as KIAs as well. And you have then the rise of the farm workers movement in 1962. You have an awful lot of political ferment as well, especially in housing and employment, as well as fights against segregation and against the poll tax to vote. You have a quest for land grant rights, especially in New Mexico. You have walkouts from high schools, especially because of the miseducation of children, because many of the 1920s and 1930s kind of eugenics approaches were in fact articulated in curriculum. So you have generations of Mexican children being not only miseducated, but undereducated as well, where they were taught, in fact, things like consumer math or English for everyday use or science for everyday use, which is really were all watered down curriculum for kids because they were thought that they were less than capable. As well, you have the rise of Chicana feminist movements, and you have an anti-war movement which is very strong, including, of course, one of the largest demonstrations in Los Angeles, which ended up being repressed by Los Angeles police and sheriffs. So you have then the rise of Chicano literature and social science in the 1960s, and the rise, of course, things like Mexican American studies. You have almost an explosion in literary efforts as well, and the rise of Mecha as one of the student movements of the 1960s. So to the present, we have now this decade of the Hispanic, and recently I think we had a Hispanic month very recently, and now we have a population of about 37,185,000 persons of Mexican origin, about 9.7% of Puerto Rican origin, 3.9% of Cuban origin, and we have a rising, of course, population of Central Americans as well. So the Mexican origin population in the U.S., so this is only takes us to 2017, you have, of course, a growth in the U.S. born, which is the largest percentage here in pale green. And you still have, however, the introduction of immigration of Mexicans. However, there were more Mexicans returning since 2018 to 2024 to Mexico than you have Mexicans coming into the United States. Migration itself, of course, has its own history, especially during the 70s and through the 80s. You have a rise in immigration itself. But net migration, of course, between 2013 and 2018, if you look at it here, you have even a greater migration of Mexicans returning to Mexico than you have coming in. So between 1980 and 2000, immigration was the principal driver of the Latino population, as the Latino immigrant population boomed from 4.2 million to 14.1. Since then, however, the primary source of growth has been U.S. births. Between 2000 and 2010, there were 9.6 million births in the U.S., while the number of newly arrived immigrants were 6.5. But nevertheless, you have the continuous growth of the population, and there are some good news as well. And the good news is that even though we have an increase in population, we have a decrease in the high school dropout rates, and those are looking pretty good. And you have this real drop in the dropout rate itself from high school, which are very, very good news, and increase in college graduates. And all of this has very much to do with what I would call the 1960s, the post-1960 impact of the Chicano movement and the rise of Chicano studies as well as the introduction of a real insistence on equitable treatment of our students, as well as programs of attracting our students even to the very present moment. And one of the most interesting and dynamic aspects that, in fact, that are occurring is that, in fact, Hispanic men and women have raised their education levels, but have been unable to close the education gap with white men and women yet. But nevertheless, you do have this rise, and that to me is one of the hallmarks, in fact, of a successful change in the United States of Mexican origin populations. We still have, however, a sizable percentage of our youth who are DACA recipients, and we're still diddling around as to whether to regularize their status or not, which I think, from my particular point of view, rather criminal. If you look at voting, you still have the majority of voters, in fact, are Democrats, and they do make a difference. And by the way, in who gets elected, and you see the 2020 presidential vote, you see where you have high density of Latino precincts. You have 73% voting for Biden and 24% voting for Trump. And low density Latinos, you have 45% voting having voted for Biden and 53.6% voting for Trump. And you see this all the way through, both in precincts in California and New Mexico as well. So that, in fact, you have a tendency for Mexicans in general to vote Democratic and not this last version of the Republican Party. We still have a transborder economy, in which we began our conversations a while back, in which, in fact, you have this entire U.S.-Mexico product sharing, in which you have at least 40, and now because of the new version of NAFTA, 50% of all products, in fact, that are assembled by the maquiladoras in Mexico, in fact, have to originate in North America. So in fact, the source of many of the ingredients of the products, in fact, that are assembled in Mexico, from cars to television sets, originated in the United States itself. The downside of this is that, in fact, the only way in which to maintain that kind of process of the maquiladoras is, in fact, through low-wage labor. So if you keep low-wage labor in Mexico, then we take advantage of that by exporting those assembled goods into the United States at a much reduced price. But it's at the backs of, in fact, Mexican labor. So that's what's given up. And this is what we have to understand. And so therefore, people are going to come across the border. And this gives you an indication now of the militarization of the border itself. You have ICE being expanded 15-fold. They've shifted from pistols to AR-16s, to SWAT teams, detection dogs, vehicle barriers, surveillance equipment, such as sensors, floodlights, tripwires, cameras, mobile observation towers, radar blimps, P-3 Orion surveillance aircraft, helicopters and drones, and more importantly, the integration of networks of military, ICE, state and local law enforcement databases and communication links. And you have, of course, you have expansions of checkpoints. And this is a this was a two-day job putting this concertina wire. This is the same concertina wire that was used in Vietnam to keep people alive. These, in fact, are the recorded migrant deaths between 1999 and 2019. We've turned parts of the Sonora, Arizona desert and also the Chihuahua desert into what I would call facsimiles of howitzers, where people by the thousands have died crossing that border, all because of the kind of policies that we've indicated of trying to compress people to cross the border in order to prevent them from coming to the United States, with a certain result of thousands of deaths. We still have other issues. We suffered immeasurably because of COVID. This is the percentage of U.S. Latino COVID deaths from January 20th to 21. If you look at this, 29% of the deaths in California were of Mexican origin. In Arizona, 23%. When you make up a bit more than that, but nevertheless, deaths themselves were overrepresented here. And you see the same pattern. So what's the future? If you look at 1212 census projections, they're not too far off. You have Anglos peaking at about almost 200 million in 2024 and then decrease from 2026 to 2060. Hispanics double from 53 million to 120.8 million in 2060, probably a little less than that. And 1 in 3 compared to 1 in 6 today of Anglos. Reasons, no outbreeding, but depopulating without immigrants and children. As the US population grows older, will be 1 in 5, 65 and over in 2056 with few replacements, so that immigrant children will be supporting them in their Social Security needs. The birth rates for Anglo women is 1.9, for Hispanics 2.4, while replacement is 2.1. And if you want to know what's going to happen in the future, you need to probably look at, in terms of cultural aspects anyway, of language and business and intermarriage, political participation and implications, look at California. In Arizona, we're still suffering from what I would consider the old eugenics notion of representing Mexicans. And let me get off of this share here and provide you with a new one.
But need help getting your taxpayer benefits? Are you an inmate but want your Biden stimulus check? Mark Kelly is here to help. Mark Kelly is a United States Senator.
So we have then this new version of racialism, in which, in fact, you have a Mexican so-called illegal being represented front and center by this present cast of characters trying to unseat Kelly. Unfortunately, you have a very tight race. So my point to you is that these old tropes are still being used in the present, unfortunately, and I think it's people of goodwill should, in fact, have some role in fact, ceasing and desisting from that kind of representation of this population again and again and again and again. Thank you very much, all of you, for your presence. I hope that, in fact, I've been able to share something with you that's worthwhile.
Thank you, Don Carlos, very much for an excellent talk. We have actually about 15 minutes for question and answer. So I know we've got a couple of questions already in the chat box, and you can also raise your hand and I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself if you just want to ask a question directly. Let's see. First off, we have a question from Dean Ibanez, who asks, was the Gadsden purchase a lopsided deal?
Not for Santana. he got his $15 million because, in fact, Mexico was broke. But there's an interesting sidebar. By the way, Mr. Is this Dean Ibanez?
Yes.
Are you available, Dean Ibanez? Are you there?
Let me see. I'm not sure if he's still here. I'm just looking through the. I think Dean is gone. Actually.
Okay, well, to answer Dean's question, there are cables between the United States State Department and the Mexican Ministry of, I think, Foreign Affairs, in which a statement is made that unless Mexico agrees to the terms of the offer, that a war was going to be initiated again. So, in a way, it is a forced sale, at least according to the cable itself. That's an indication that we have that, in fact, force was going to be used if they didn't agree to it. But Mexico was not in any shape or form in order to resist that, because it was basically broke. And it was under the tutelage of Santana himself. And it was Santana, of course, who agreed to it. But I don't think he had a choice. It was either at the point of a gun or not.
Okay, let's see. We have a question from Judith, who says, thanks for an enriching presentation. I'm very interested in using family histories to understand regional histories from the perspective of lived experience, and asks, why is this approach not taught more broadly? I guess I would add that. Why is it not taught more broadly?
I think there's a kind of snootiness, academic snootiness, that you can only rely on archival material as the basis of historical renditions, when in fact oral histories are the only remnants that many populations have left to them, because in fact educational systems are very much the consequence of a particular class position about what education is, should be considered. And oral histories, of course, are filled also with issues of all sorts, because people overtell as well as exaggerate, right? So you can't tell sometimes how much is myth and how much is fable and how much is made up. On the other hand, if the same story continues for a number of generations, more than likely there's something to it. And this is where you as a scholar then can double check your sources. If you only rely on the written word and for a particular I mean, most of the great histories that, in fact, that have been written about contemporary figures are all based on oral histories of some sort, right? And interviews. Right? So if you can do this with an upper middle class academic, with a historical figure, why can't you do it with your own family? Well, you should be able to, as long as you double check your sources, or try to get as a verifiable verification of a particular event or a particular point of view. I do that all the time. I mean, the only reason that I work in this area and use oral histories, well, because I know it to be true. I know, for example, that for real, that my mother would not make up the story about her mother plugging up the wounds of dying revolutionaries with towels and with bed sheets. Why should she make it up at the same time her father's being killed?
Carlos, can I ask a follow-up to that?
Yeah.
Do you know of any sources, good sources, archival repositories that have recorded oral histories or transcripts of those? And,
well, at different times, the 1930s, certainly you had all the oral histories that were in fact created. Oh yeah, there are a lot of oral histories. Yeah. Also, Patsy Preciado has developed, I think, quite a number of oral histories. And she's a font of information for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would add the University of Arizona Special Collections.
Yeah,
It's a
absolutely.
pretty good source. There's a folklore collection.
Yeah,
And-
Jim Griffith had an awful lot to do with it. Yeah.
Yep, yeah, and also the Arizona State Museum Library, I believe, has some stuff as well from the Doris Duke
Yeah.
project back in the day. Yeah, and there's a lot of recorded.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Also,
Let's see.
New Mexico, for example, is another one. The Zimmerman Library and their Southwest Institute within the Zimmerman Library. Very
Okay.
rich archivally as well.
I have another question here, and I actually want to also add that several people have given a shout out to you, Dr. Velez Ibanez, about the just how they enjoyed the presentation. So
Thank you.
This one is from Francisca Hernandez. She says, "Gracias, Carlos. As a longtime practitioner of Chicano studies, what is your view as to how we in Arizona can combat the ongoing attacks against our discipline, not to mention our people, in the current moment? And can you name 3 specific actions or some specific actions that you think people might take in this moment? I mean, in this moment in particular, as we go into, an election time."
I'll tell you who's doing a fabulous job. That's Dr. Anna O'Leary. Anna O'Leary, from my particular position, is doing it right. Because what she does is that she demands that Mexican American studies have a close working and real relationship with the broader Mexican community in Tucson. As well as, however, she also conducts her work across the border. One of the great strengths of the department at the University of Arizona is its insistence that its faculty also work with colleagues from Sonora. And I try to do that. I try to do some of that myself. But from my particular point of view, those are the strongest programs. And those are the ones that will have longevity. Why? Well, because Chicano studies and Mexican American studies arises not from the academy. It arises from 2 great discontents. One, the first discontent is a discontent with ongoing conditions: economic, educational, social, political. The second discontent was, and to a certain point still is, a characterization of this population as a people without a history, or treated as a people without a history, and or that they are merely immigrants. Mexicans don't become immigrants until 1848. And for those of us from Southern Arizona, till 1853. It is not a natural condition. It was, in fact, an imposed condition. And so that recognition of that fact, of those facts, induced people like me and people like Ana and others to say, enough. We're going to insist, and by the way, with the close collaboration and true friendship with people like Tom Sheridan and people like Jim Griffith and people like Dave Weber, bless his soul, who's no longer with us, who insisted on getting closer to what we regarded as the truth of the matter. That is, that this is and still is a very heterogeneous population with its own warts and with its own weaknesses, but with great strength and with great resilience and with almost heroic standing when they had nothing and made something of nothing. And that's how this population has to be regarded, and not just as another immigrant group. It isn't. The border, for many of us, is a place to cross. It's not a place to stop. But now you have concertina wire up there. When as a kid, my mom and dad and I and my sister used to go to Elvira's to go have lunch in Nogales, Sonora. And then when we came back, my mother was greeted by the Border Patrol officer with, Mrs. Vélez, how are you today? But in Spanish. Señora Vélez, ¿cómo está? Here's an Anglo, and I still remember him, an Anglo guy, about 6'4", big, tall guy, probably from Minnesota, with piercing blue eyes, with Smokey the hat, the hat that he had on, because they all wore kind of like a brown suit with, in fact, with a leather belt,
Like a Park Service uniform.
Yes, with a Smokey the Bear hat. And he would say to my mother in Spanish, ¿Cómo está, señora Vélez? Qué bien verla. It's nice to see you. That's what the border was. Not that concertina mess that's there.
And that's not long ago.
That's not long ago. That's my generation. And I very much resent seeing a blimp on top of Nogales and concertina wire used in Vietnam, for God's sakes. And now this governor who's putting up empty, what do they call these big
Shipping containers.
What do they call it?
Shipping containers.
Yeah, shipping containers to stop the border up. And all people do are just go around it. I mean, that's idiotic. All for what? For a political stance, like that last anti-Kelly remark. But what happens is that those mean something. And then you have people like one of the candidates talking about an invasion. Where's the invasion? Yeah, lately you had what, 2 million people in the last 5 years crossing the border. Yeah, something like that. I don't know what the numbers are, but that's because stuff is falling apart in Central America, for God's sakes. Everything from earthquakes to floods to dysfunctional governments. I mean, you name it. Right. It's not an invasion. Those people are fleeing conditions that they can't live, for God's sakes. Right? But they're being used by these Trump-like clones. And we're paying the piper for it. Again, with that last image that was used by a Mexican-looking a gardener. Probably looked like me when I was 16. Yeah. So we have to continue to fight. That's all there is to it. Period. But I know Leary's doing it right because she has deep community relations and deep transborder relations, and you have to keep those because that's the basis of your strength, not just the academic program. You can publish all the books you want, but you're still going to get this kind of political repression. I call it, this is political repression, period. Nothing more, nothing less. You don't want Mexicans voting. Why? Well, because they'll vote Democratic. Or at least a chunk of them will, 71%.
Carlos, I have a question, and we're, pardon me, we're about at almost at 2:30.
Yeah.
But I am curious about a couple things. So, what led you to become an anthropologist, an academic, an anthropologist? And then as I noted earlier on in your bio, that you got your PhD at UCSD around in the 70s. So you were, in Southern California at a pretty critical moment. I grew up in Escondido, so I have a pretty strong connection to the border area myself. But I was born in '68, so I actually have memories of some of those some parts of the 70s. But I'd like, maybe you could describe for us, first what led you into the field of academia and to become an anthropologist, and then what was Southern California like in that moment to be getting a PhD and the rise of the Chicano movement and all of that was happening.
When I was 14 years old, I read a book entitled Kon-Tiki by Thor Heyerdahl, which was about the circumnavigation across the Pacific by indigenous populations using the stars and the shape of the waves to circumnavigate the Pacific. And I always wondered to myself, my God, that's really interesting. So that's how they got to the other side. And now we have Polynesian peoples as the aftermath of that. So Kon-Tiki kind of pushed me to read more of the same. So I got a little bit interested in that. But I went into anthropology because I didn't know enough. I had been teaching at San Diego State, and I helped put together the first Mexican American Studies department there at San Diego State University. And I was an English teacher. I taught English. I took my master's in English here at the University of Arizona. Not here, I'm at ASU now, but at U of A. And so I taught English. I taught high school English, and then I went to California to teach at San Diego State. I was recruited by Gus Segada there. And so I taught there, but also participated in all the Chicano movements and all the politics of the time. But the department itself became a hodgepodge of ideological oppositions, of the Maoists versus the Leninists versus the Marxists versus the Bolsheviks versus the nationalists versus this and that. And so you had all of these political segments. And I said to myself, this is nuts. We have common issues, and we're not taking care of common issues. And here we are, in fact, arguing about the number of angels at the tip of a pin. That's how ridiculous I found an awful lot of the discourse. But I also knew in looking around me and trying to get as close to the reality of the population itself, that literature and English wasn't good enough for me. That it didn't provide me with the tools that I needed to really analyze what I thought I was looking at but didn't understand. So I kind of tied up Thor Heyerdahl in a kind of mythic idea somewhere in the back of my mind. And by accident, when I was fed up with all of the infighting at San Diego State, I got into my car and I was just about to make a decision to resign from San Diego State and to go back to school, but I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. But I got into my car and I drove down the 405 out of San Diego and saw on my right side, as I reached La Jolla, UCSD. And I got off and I started walking around what was then a very early version of the University of California, San Diego in La Jolla. And I happened to see Department of Anthropology. So I walked in and the guy who was sitting there was either Mark Swartz or one of the greats in psychological anthropology. Oh boy, he wrote Children of the Kibbutz and Kibbutz. Melford Spiro. And so we started chatting. I said, I've always been interested in anthropology. And he said, well, why don't you apply? I said, because I've been thinking of leaving San Diego State. He says, well, why don't you apply? I said, yeah, but I don't have any courses in anthropology. Oh, he says, that's okay. You can take some undergraduate courses and start preparing yourself. So I applied and I was accepted at UCSD. Now I couldn't get away with that now because, now they're really a highfalutin department. It was a highfalutin department then, but they were a little more elastic. And so that's how I got into anthropology. But I had some training in Mexico as well. And that also helped. So my career as an anthropologist basically began in 1970. That's really where it started, 2 years after you were born.
Excellent. Well, Carlos, we're at time. I just want to say thank you so much for all that you do, all that you've done, all the incredible work, the scholarship. It's a real honor to have you here with us today, and I know everybody on this call or this Zoom feels the same way. So,
well, I thank you very much for the opportunity, and to all folks who are there. Judith, I see that you're here. Judith Friedenberg is one of the top anthropologists in the world, who happens to join us. Who's joining us from Argentina, as a matter of fact.
muy bien.
She's a retired anthropologist from the University of Maryland. Very good.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you on the next, hopefully, the Southwest Center series event.
Thank you very much to everybody. Adios.
Adios.